Ladies and gentlemen, members of the board, I have two wonders to share with you tonight. First, allow me to present the next evolutionary milestone of our species, immortality. Ever for theatrics, Dr. Monroe says this with his arms outstretched, his burgundy dress coat flowing with every gesture. There's a collective gasp from the audience when the curtain drops and the pale, topless form of a seated man makes his appearance. Shackles pin his wrists to the arms of the chair. His face eerily mirrors the confusion of the onlookers. This man, a thief, a murderer, and admitted pox to our society, has generously offered to help demonstrate the latest breakthrough in medicine. He pauses for effect before removing a small, decorative vial from his belt. This was born of my research into xenotransplantation. I'm sure you must remember Sir Winston. They did. They would never forget last year's unraveling of a genderless human body, naked and draped callously on the floor, nor the drooping eyes of the basset hound's head that had surgically replaced the original. For hours they'd watched with abated breath while the monstrosity lapped up water from a dish, only for it to seep freely through the stitches at its throat, the fingers and toes twitching as if to decipher whether to obey their new master. Dr. Monroe smiles at the recognition sweeping the room. Yes, beyond cellular rejection, it all came down to one thing. The secret was in the temperature. But I digress. It was through this previous research that I observed the secret electrical blueprints all living organisms use to repair themselves, and thus developed the Invictus toxin you see here. When ingested, and given ample time to spread through the vascular system, it will open the sodium ion channels of the body and react to an electrical field. Grinning, he flips an enormous switch, and the unnerving sense of buzzing fills the air. Brilliant blue sparks appear to flit along every surface, and John Haynes of Phillips & Sons becomes sure that the entire room will burst into flames. There is also the bizarre side effect of rendering the drinker impervious to pain. I imagined the limitless benefits this would have as an anesthesia, but then of course, the rueful surgeons could never perform surgery. The patient would simply keep healing before even a minor incision could be completed. He produces a long shaving razor and waves it for all to see. This is it. Exodus acta probat. Slowly, suspensefully, he brings the razor to rest below the captive's ribcage. Sensing what's to come, the man cries out, whipping his head frantically while struggling against the restraints. Ignoring him, the doctor slices inward and down the specimen's skin, which separates like softened wax. But no blood pours out. He doesn't cry out in pain, nor does he seem to have noticed the damage done. And then, miraculously, the wound begins to close, starting from the top of the gash, heading down until the skin appears as unblemished as before. The crowd is dumbfounded. Some doubt their eyes, even their own minds. But it had happened there, before them. A voice cracks from the back of the room. Doctor? With purposeful speed, Monroe reveals a pistol from beneath his coat, presses the barrel against the forehead of the nearest audience member, and fires. The target, Rosa Smith of the St. Mercury's Herald, slides to the floor screaming. Though it's clear from the damage to the wall behind her that the bullet had passed completely through her skull. She continues screaming, as lively as before. It is fortunate that Miss Smith had the forethought to drink Invictus. Indeed, you have all been preparing yourselves for this evening. He points at the empty champagne flutes that stand at every table. The silence that follows is malleable, like taffy, locking shut the mouth of every guest. And then, curiosity wins out, and a diminutive man nearest the stage gently nibbles on the back of his own hand. His eyes grow wide when he senses not even the faintest of pain, and then he clamps down, peeling the flesh from the back of his thumb to the wrist. Again, as before, there is no blood, only a small shimmer of blue light as the skin curls back into place. The violence begins subdued as the guests test the water of the vast ocean before them. And then it erupts. A large man from 2 states north asks, particularly begs, for the pistol from Monroe. When he receives it, he dares the others to fire at him, vividly living out his fantasies as an indestructible hero. A woman who couldn't stop reminding everyone how she'd traveled for 3 nights by train is absorbed in twisting the long nails off her right hand and then watching as they clitter across the table back onto their roosts. "This is going to be marvelous," she says. "Think of all the women who would die to never have another broken nail." Amidst the chaos of the snapping limbs and frantic stabbing, Dr. Hurst stops, panting for breath. "You've really done it, Dr. Monroe. A world without pain, suffering, injury. Though I fear you may have put me out of work." He laughs, stroking his white goatee. "But you said there would be 2 items to present tonight. With your first as earth-shattering as this, I can't imagine how you'd top it." That's when he catches the sight of it. The first drop of scarlet they'd seen all night. The prisoner's thumb is bleeding. Horrified, Dr. Hertz turns to Monroe. "Doctor, what do you make of this? Why hasn't he healed?" Monroe doesn't answer at first, but instead appears absorbed in the pocket watch he's holding. "Don't worry, good doctor. He clearly must have been injured and subsequently healed when we restrained him. It simply opened up again, roughly 8 minutes after the toxin had been metabolized." Everyone stands silent, hanging on every word. "Despite my greatest efforts, the Invictus toxin passes through the human body in 1800 seconds. That is to say, half an hour. Thus, we move on to the final experiment of tonight. An exercise in inevitability." He glances at his watch again before bowing and pointing towards the test subject. As they follow his gesture, the pale man begins screaming and convulsing in a fit. The wound along his stomach opens as if cut by some phantom blade. A glaring red crescent, much like the grin of the elusive Dr. Monroe. I live in a pretty small, relatively unknown town. This is the internet, so I won't divulge too much information, but I will tell you it's in southern Wisconsin. I live on the corner of Lawn and Elm Street, and pretty near to my house is a stretch of road that most people called Mirror Avenue. Of course, it's not really technically an avenue, just an extension of Lawn Street, and it's not the whole road, just a short stretch within the block adjacent to the one my house is on. I've lived here my whole life, and everyone I know has referred to it as Mirror Avenue at some point, but many of them couldn't give me an explanation as to why it was called that. The stories I got were mostly always different, usually something about a mirror maker, or whatever you call the people who made mirrors, back when the town was founded, who got caught up in some kind of cult, and the street being cursed. Of course, the exact accounts varied. One told to me by a friend in middle school included the street being split down the middle by a very long, man-sized mirror. People would look into the mirror and the reflection would be doing something different, usually mischievous, and if there were more than one person in the mirror at a time, the reflections would try to hurt each other, and it was said that the people could feel the pain inflicted by their reflections. This was just the ramblings of a middle schooler, and tonight on my way home, I found out exactly why they call it Mirror Avenue. I worked relatively late today, until 8 o'clock, and this being December, it got dark pretty early. I got off at 8 and decided to walk home instead of calling one of my parents. Despite being 18, I never learned to drive for financial reasons, and the fact that I lived in a town small enough that there was very little that wasn't in walking distance. I walk to and from work all the time, but I usually take Elm Street instead of Lawn. It's faster, but tonight I thought since I really didn't have to be home at any specific time, I would take the longer way. This route would take me right down Lawn Street to Mirror Avenue, where I had the single, most terrifying experience of my life. The walk home was pretty normal, until I reached the point by the park where I would normally have diverged onto Elm Street. I turned onto Lawn Street without even thinking about the whole mirror thing. Any time I had ever walked this way before was in the daytime, so I was never really afraid, and therefore it wasn't anywhere near the front of my mind. I was only walking for about a minute before I noticed, but there was someone walking on the other side of the street. I looked over as soon as I noticed, and they did the same. I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked like they were wearing the same coat that I had on, only I couldn't see a face because they had their hood up. I walked for a few more seconds and almost tripped on the edge of an uneven piece of sidewalk. It was then that I noticed something strange. I guess had I thought more about the mirror thing before, I would have expected it, but the guy on the other side of the street stumbled at the same time. I stood there for a second and then started to walk again, thinking maybe it was a fluke. But to test it, I stopped abruptly and watched to see what he did. Of course he stopped, watching me the whole time I was watching him. Now I was certain something was off. I yelled across the street at the guy, but I didn't hear anything from him, even though he seemed to be making the same motion I was, as if he was yelling too. I stood there for about 5 minutes, waving my arms around and things like that, watching the man on the other side of the street as he mimicked me perfectly. Eventually, I decided to see what happened if I got closer, and so I stepped out onto the street, and he did the same. I stopped, scared for a moment. I couldn't tell who it was because of the hood, and I wasn't sure what would happen if I got any closer. And the whole time, he was silently copying me. Every aspect of my movement synced perfectly, as if he was my reflection. Now I was thinking about the mirror thing, and based on the stories I had heard growing up, I expected that nothing good could come of this. My curiosity got the better of me though, and I got closer until I was just about in the very center of the road, with my reflection just on the other side of the lane divider. I almost reached out and tried to touch it, but I was too afraid, and at the last minute I pulled my hand back. It was then that I heard a sort of growling from the reflection. Apparently, it had wanted me to touch it, as it made this clear by mumbling from underneath its hood. I thought for a moment and wanted to see if this was some sort of reflection, so I figured maybe if I put my hood up, he would end up putting his down. And so, I stepped back to the sidewalk because I was uncertain as to what would happen next, and I prepared myself. I was shaking, partially in anticipation and partially because I was terrified of what might happen to me. I was obviously in some deep shit here, as I knew now that this had to have something to do with the old legends. I stood there, my hands just above my shoulders, ready to put my hood up with my reflection doing the same. I counted down from 10, whispering to myself and praying that this was just some kid messing with me, or that it was all somehow in my head. As I got closer to 1, I shook more violently, so much so that it had become apparent that my reflection was also shaking. As I finally hit 1 and put my hood up, my suspicions were confirmed, as I saw the guy on the other side put his hood down. I have no way to accurately describe what I saw. The only thing I can say is that it had my same basic features, but they were contorted and twisted in a hideous and disgusting way that left me staring at it in a horrified daze. It was smiling at me, and that's when I realized that it was no longer doing exactly as I was. I stood there on the sidewalk in shock as it stepped off the curb and began walking towards me. I panicked and ran down the street, and my reflection followed, only now it was staring at me the whole time, not just when I was looking at it. It was faster than me, and the closer I got to the edge of the block, the closer it got to me. I was certain for a moment that I could hear it saying something, but I couldn't tell what it was. Just as I was about to reach the corner, it reached out and grabbed my hood, tearing it off as I forced myself forward. I thought it had me. I thought I was dead, another victim of Mirror Avenue. But when I heard the coat rip, it was the most beautiful sound I ever heard, and I ran like hell until I got right in front of my house, and it was only then that I realized that it was no longer chasing me. I assume it must have stopped when I got past the edge of the block, when I exited the stretch of Lawn Street that was Mirror Avenue. I looked back at Mirror Avenue, expecting to see it standing there on the corner or something, but I couldn't see my reflection anywhere. This worried me, and I got inside as quickly as I could. My family wasn't home. They left a note saying that they had gone Christmas shopping and to call when I got home. The first thing I did was lock all the doors and windows and close the curtains, and then I fetched my brother's old sword that he had bought at a Renaissance fair, just in case. I called and didn't mention anything about what had happened. Later, when they finally got home, I told them that I had run into a dog and that's why my coat was ripped. I wasn't sure if I should say anything to anyone about what really happened or not. I was afraid they might think I was crazy or on drugs or something. I might tell some friends at school, or I guess anyone who listens to this. But one thing is for certain. I'm never taking the long way home again. This isn't a confession. You can't prove a damn thing, so don't even try. I'll deny it to my grave. I'm on my third drink for the evening anyways. You can't trust the word of a drunken man. That's when I start to feel anything these days. The third drink? Sometimes it takes 4, but usually 3 will do. It's the same cycle every night for weeks now. I drink, then I start to feel. Then the fear comes over me. Then I drink some more until I pass out. Wake up, slog through the day. Keep my head down, keep my chin up. Don't draw anyone's attention. Go home, repeat. One night, a few weeks back, there was a man at my door. I answered it, wondering what in the devil he was doing there at this time of night. I live at the end of my street, and there's no one around for quite a ways. And even the evangelicals that comb the neighborhood rarely make it all the way out to my house. "Help me," he gasped, his blood-flecked lips quivering in the rain. His forearm was badly broken, bits of bone sticking out through the skin. He was pale and drenched, the rain and blood dripping steadily from his haggard frame, pooling on my porch beneath him. "There's been an accident. I need help," he winced. "Can you help me?" I nodded dumbly, shocked at his state, then ran inside to look for my cell phone. But by the time I got back to the door with it, he was gone. The only sign of him a trail of splattered red leading down my front steps and out into the front yard. I stood there, shocked for a moment. And then I put my phone away, slammed the door and locked it. I don't know why, I was just scared. Frightened by the whole affair. And some part of me, some damn selfish part of me, kept saying that it was okay, that it was somebody else's problem. He's gone. Forget about it. So I poured myself a drink to ease my nerves, and then another. A few drinks later, I had forgotten all about him. And a few drinks after that, I had drank myself to sleep. I woke up with my head throbbing. I'm not a heavy drinker. Well, used to not be one anyways. I stepped outside and noticed that there was no blood on my porch and breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe the rain washed it all away, I thought. Or maybe it hadn't happened at all. I went to work nursing my hangover, but I made it through the day, came home, and tried to relax. I'd slept poorly the night before, and my day took what energy I had left, so I decided early in the evening to call it a night. I was just about to go to bed when there was another knock at the door. I froze, looking over to it. My heart raced. I tried to laugh off my rising fear. It was just someone at the door, nothing to be afraid of. But as my hand reached for the knob, I heard his voice, the same quaking shudder of a voice from the night before. "Help! I need help!" I stood stone still as he pounded on the door. "God, it hurts!" he shouted. "Please, why won't you help me?" I put my back to the door, bracing it, squeezing my eyes shut. This isn't real, I thought. It can't be. And after a few seconds, the knocking stopped and it was quiet. I flung open the door, but there was no one there. No trace of blood or sign of his presence. Unsettled, I shut the door, locked it, and reached for a bottle. And so it went for 4 more days, each night the same. The knocking, the horrible man at my door, the cries for help. And each night, I secured the door and waited until it stopped, then drank myself into oblivion. By the 7th night, I had had enough. I made a stiff drink as soon as I got home, and then another after that one. I had thought of nothing but the events of the previous week that day, so naturally, I was anticipating the knocking when it came again that night, confirming my paranoid fears. I was waiting for it. I threw open the door upon the first knock, and there he was, battered arm hanging limp at his side, pale face twisted into a grimace. But before he could say anything, I leveled my shotgun at his face and pulled the trigger. His head popped like a blister, and I fired a second time, blowing his arm clean off and leaving a hole in his torso. Covered in his wet viscera, I shut the door. I want to say that I was in a trance, that I was on autopilot and out of my head, but that's not true. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was trying to make a point to myself. See, I'm a level-headed man. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural or anything like that. We live in a rational world, and I damn well wasn't going to sit back and let my head play tricks on me without fighting back. They say blood is hard to wash off, but that's not true. His blood washed right off of me. 1 shower later, I was good as new. So when I finished cleaning up and calming down and went back to the front door, I likewise expected there to be nothing there, as there had been no trace of him left from the previous nights. I couldn't believe it when I opened the door and his remains were slumped outside like a sack full of meat. I reached down and poked the corpse. It was solid. The porch was covered in blood and gore. Once more I panicked, and this time I did go into a sort of trance. The hours passed in a blur as I dragged the body around the back of the house, dug a shallow grave, cleaned off the porch as best I could, and took another shower. And then I made another drink. Tomorrow, the knocking would come again, I was sure. I hadn't just killed a man and buried him in my backyard. When I got home the next evening, I sat and waited anxiously. Any moment, the knock would come. The man would again be at my door, waiting for me, asking for help. Maybe tonight I'd laugh, invite him in, ask him if he wanted a drink, I thought, sipping my own drink nervously. The minutes stretched out, and it felt like I'd waited an eternity. When it finally came, the knocking. I breathed a sigh of relief as I rushed to the door. But it wasn't the man from the previous nights. It was the police. A car had gone off the road the night before. They wanted to know if I'd seen anyone. Maybe it was my drunken state that allowed me to lie so convincingly. But after telling them I knew nothing about it, they bid me a good evening and left. My pulse pounded in my head. This couldn't be happening, I thought. It wasn't real. The thoughts piled on one by one, and all I could do to quell them was keep drinking until I lost consciousness. I called in sick the next day. I checked my backyard, and sure enough, The grave I dug was still there, still fresh. I dug him up, burned the body until it was ash, and when I was done, I went back inside the house and numbly sat down. And since then, I can't feel anything. Not until I drink, usually 3, sometimes 4. And it's only then that I can start to feel it. The fear. See, I'm not afraid of ghosts. I don't believe in them. I've never believed in them. Probably in part because I was raised by my heavily superstitious mother. She made her living as a psychic, telling fortunes. She claimed that she had what she called the sight, that she could see a person's fate before it happened. And she had a steady stream of gullible clients that kept a roof over our heads and food on our table. So I didn't make a big deal out of it. But like any kid, I rebelled against her and her beliefs. And when I left home, I found plenty of support for that rebellion. Psychics aren't real, right? No one can see the future, right? Because now I'm afraid that my mother wasn't faking it. That she really could see the fate of all those people who came to her. And I'm afraid. I'm so terribly damn afraid that now I can see it too. Do you ever watch other people in the subway? It's so strange to have to ignore someone who's right up there in your face. A can of sardines springs to mind, except passengers aren't joined by a bond of thick oil or brine. Instead, they're stewing in a miasma of sweat, cologne, and annoyance. Everybody absorbed in their own little worlds, warm little cocoons. There, whizzing through the bowels of the city at a brisk clip, you'll find people reading books, newspapers, maybe on a PlayStation Portable, maybe on a smartphone. Except me. I'll always be looking through the thick glass windows at the flickering blackness just beyond. Sometimes, late at night, I hope I'll get on that same train once more, so I can see it all again. It had been one of those weeks. Actually, it had been one of those months, where the targets piled up like so much dirty laundry. The boss was on my case, miserable balding fart with his mortgage and his European sports car, riding us all for another bullshit project for some client across the country. The days and nights lost their meaning. In at work early to beat the crowd, heading home without ever seeing the light of sun. Caffeine was my only friend. The last thing on the agenda for the workday was the mad sprint for the last train home, because the miserable bastard wouldn't even sign off on the late-night taxi claims. It showed up on the work-life balance indicators, he'd said. It had been another mindless day of numbers, presentation slides, and text. To be frank, I didn't even know if the version of the meaningless report I was working on was the 5th or the 15th, nor could I have told you the difference between the two. The office had already emptied out an hour before, my last coworkers giving me a commiserating pat on the back as they headed off. I cursed as I stuffed my laptop and swept some papers into my bag. I was going to miss the train. The stale warmth of the building gave way to the bitter cold as I hit the streets running. The station was deserted. Not unthinkable at this time of the night, but eerie all the same. There's something about a hollow space meant for crowds. I'm not talking about muggers or anything like that. There's an air of the forbidden about these empty spaces. That's how that night started out. Expectant, waiting for something to happen. Not that I cared at that time. The escalators were out for the night. I was wheezing hard by the time I got to the bottom. That old college fitness long drowned under an ocean of booze, buried under a mountain of fast food. I thought the last train had already left, resigning myself to a long wait for an expensive taxi ride back. I was about to leave when a train pulled up with the familiar scream of metal on metal. Graffiti adorned the gray skin of the train, tribal tattoos for the modern locomotive. The doors hissed, and warm air belched from the cabin. I got in. The train, strangely, was full. Not packed, but it was crowded. I found myself a seat between an old man in a large brown overcoat and a young lady wearing a dark formal dress, a large flower pinned to her breast. Her face a mask of mascara and eyeshadow, inexpertly applied. Across from me sat a pair of army guys in fatigues, their scalps shining pink under their tight buzz cuts, and many more besides. It was a puzzling thing to have a cabin so full late at night and with such a motley crew of inhabitants. With a shudder, the train pulled out from the station. I settled back contentedly to my seat. The network connection in the tunnels was never dependable. I had to find another way to entertain myself for the ride home. The noise from the screech of the rails and the rush of the air outside seemed muted. Instead, the cabin was filled with a soft susurrus, the hushed tones of a crowd in a theater, expectant but subdued. The cabin felt colder than it should have been. Was the heating out again? It couldn't be. I was certain that the cabin was warmer than the platform a second ago. Yet now, it felt like I was back outside in the howling cold. I tugged my jacket a little tighter. I looked at the hodgepodge of strange individuals in the cabin. Everybody seemed out of place. Why would there be a gaggle of high school kids, obviously inebriated, on this late night? Or the waifish girl that was wearing what seemed to be a school uniform? I shifted uncomfortably on the sculpted plastic seat. Not a single mobile phone or any other electronic device in sight. A strange sight in this day and age. I looked up at the row of LED lights that indicated the train's progress along my route. 4 more stops. I was still staring at the display when the train whizzed by the next station. It didn't stop, didn't even slow down. It just kept going. The lights and pillars of the station streamed by in a blur. I jerked upright in my seat, my eyes widening. What kind of train had I gotten on? The rest of the crowd was unfazed by this development. If anything, the low buzz of whispers got even louder as the train progressed. We were still hurtling through the dark tunnel, the overhead lights flickering on and off, when the little girl in the school uniform stared at me, wide-eyed. She crept over to the group of high schoolers and tugged at the sleeve of one of the young men. He must have been a basketball player, towering over his companions. He nearly had to bend double to bring his ear down to the little girl's face. Her jaw worked up and down as she whispered something to him urgently. I heard nothing over the sound of the train. He blinked and took a step back when he looked back in my direction, as though seeing me for the first time. His handsome face twisted strangely. What was it? Anger? No, he looked like he wanted something. He looked hungry. His compatriots noticed the break in conversation and directed their gazes to the focus of his attention. To me. The same gamut of emotions cycled through their faces. Shock, and then a sharpening, a hardening of their features. They were hungry too. The giant took a step forward, perhaps meaning some harm for the slight on his person that I must have committed. One of the high school girls held him back. The feeling spread through the cabin, like a spark arcing from person to person. 2 uniformed men looking up and tightening their jaws. The old man next to me perking up and scooting down another seat so that he could look at me without straining his neck. Outside, a blur of lights told me that another station had shot by. 3 more stops. I shrank back in my seat, the tendons straining at the surface of my hands as I clutched my bag protectively, as though that stupid gesture, grabbing onto my work, the focus of my life, would ground me and take me from this nightmare. It didn't. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, like insects crawling over my skin. Something was wrong, so clearly wrong. This strange crowd, so different, yet each of them was wearing that naked need on their faces. "Don't mind them, they're just jealous of you." The young lady by my side. Her voice was soft, mellifluous. "Don't stare back and don't talk to them." I turned to look at my erstwhile companion. "What are they jealous of? I just wanted to catch the last train home." "It's the last train home for all of us, too." She smiled. She was very pale, very beautiful. "But not all of them want to be here. And looking at you, going home tonight, makes them so very unhappy." Where'd they all come from? Was there a convention? A meeting? I cast my eyes around the cabin again, but was stopped halfway by her strong fingers on my chin. Her fingers were icy cold. She turned my head around to face her. "Everywhere, all around. Most of them don't want to be here. Except me, maybe. I'd had enough of where I was. I miss my parents. I haven't seen them in such a long time. It took a while for me to gather enough courage to go look for them." She paused, suddenly pensive at what she'd said. "You're not meant to be here, you know. You're on the wrong train. This isn't your ride." Outside the window, another station went by. My eyes flicked back to the board with all the little lights. 2 stops to home. The whispering in the cabin had started up again, louder than before, but still muffled by the sounds of the rails and the rushing air outside. They were talking about me. The atmosphere grew oppressive. The attention of the crowd felt like a rock on my chest, a vice. My breathing grew labored, each inhalation a struggle. I wheezed. My companion sensed my discomfort. "I wish I could help," she said sadly. "It'll stop when we get to the end of the line, I suppose." Her eyes lit up at the thought. She turned around and scooted up onto the seat, her knees on the hard plastic, palms on the cold glass. Even with her face pressed up against the glass, there wasn't a trace of fog in the window left by her breath, if she was even breathing at all. "Here, why don't you take this? I won't need it where I'm going." She fumbled at her dress, detached the white flower and pressed it into my hands. The sweet smell of the lily took my attention away from the pain in my chest. "We're here!" She was quivering with excitement as the train began to slow. I looked up at the board overhead. All the lights on the map had gone out. Where were we? She cupped my chin in her hands. It was only then, with her arms so close to my face, that I saw the network of fine white lines that crisscrossed her forearms. She caught the flick of my eyes towards her arms. She shrugged, sheepish. "Practice makes perfect," she said. She frowned, suddenly serious again. "This stop is for the rest of us. You can't join us. You have to stay here." She leaned forward quickly and gave me a kiss on my cheek. Her cold lips burned like an ice cube. The people in the cabin quickly turned their attention to the approaching platform. I felt the weight on my chest ease. The whispering grew into a crescendo as they pointed and chattered excitedly. The platform drew close, and what a sight it was. I didn't recognize the tiles or the posters. I must have taken this train 1,000 times. I could have closed my eyes and named every station in order and the time between stations if I wanted to. And yet, I was lost. There was nothing on the platform that helped in any way. No signs, no directions. What the platform had was people, a milling sea of heads and faces, all expectant, all eagerly waiting. When the door opened, it let in the roar of the crowd outside. Shouts, shrieks, and yells. And tears, so many tears. The passengers burst out of the train, throwing themselves into the waiting sea of people. I saw one of the army boys embracing an older gentleman, also dressed in military fatigues. None of that new-aged pixelated camouflage, though. This was old school, with big green and brown blotches. The resemblance between the two was clear. They parted, the younger man introducing his father to his compatriot. The old man hugged him as tightly as he had hugged his own son earlier. The group of teenagers whooped and leapt as they pushed their way through the crowd, seeking some new adventure for the night. I caught a last glimpse of the blonde locks of the basketball player as they vanished around the corner. The old man that was sitting by me had found an elegant-looking lady in her 30s. Her light sundress looked out of place in the biting cold of winter. Or had I mistaken the man for someone else? I looked again, and it wasn't the old man anymore, but a young couple, laughing in the prime of their lives. No, it was the same coat, and his features, lined with a jealous greed scant moments ago, were now lit with fierce joy. Just as the train doors hissed shut, I saw the girl that sat next to me on the train. She was in tears, with her arms around a well-dressed couple. She waved at me as the train pulled out of the station. I waved back. My legs shook as I got off the train at my stop. The platform was reassuringly deserted. I watched as the train screeched into the distant darkness of the tunnel. I gingerly touched the numb spot on my cheek where the girl had kissed me. My fingers came away wet. I didn't even remember tears falling. My nose was suddenly assaulted by a rich, thick greenhouse scent. Decaying plant matter. I fished out the lily from my coat pocket, where the strange girl had left it. The pristine white petals were dry to the point of crumbling, and speckled black with rot. I let it fall from my fingers and watched it bounce on the station floor. It sat there, like an unmelting snowflake on the pocked gray concrete. I stared at it for a long time before I began the long trek home. My life has been average at most. I lived in a family of 2 girls and 1 boy. There was my older sister Jenny, me, and my younger brother Alex. We had a typical childhood, I guess. Jenny was popular, with her blonde hair, blue eyes, and skinny frame. Alex, early on, showed a penchant for sports and became the star athlete of the family. But myself, just like the rest of my life, was very average. I wasn't overly smart, I wasn't ugly, but I didn't stand out. I had a small group of friends. I was average. But I idolized my older sister. Jenny was everything I would never be. She had friends upon friends upon friends. She had a string of boyfriends starting from the time she was 11. There was always some boy, some drama. She grew tired of it, but I loved it. Jenny loved me too. We were really close as children. Mom and Dad loved me, sure, but they didn't notice me like they did Jenny and Alex. Because there was nothing special about me. Not really. But Jenny didn't see it that way. See, she paid attention to me. She gave me makeovers and taught me about makeup. She used to take me shopping even with her popular friends, and show me the best clothes to wear for my body shape. She would tell me all about her amazing, glittering life, and she would listen if and when I found some small contribution to make our conversations. She was my role model. But sometimes, life isn't average. Sometimes it isn't typical. When Jenny was 16 and I was 13, she was found in her room, a bottle of pills spilled out next to her. I don't think they even bothered with much of an investigation. It was clear what she had done, although no one really knew why. Life can be funny that way. Sometimes it's the ones who seem happy who are struggling the most. It was a very difficult time for my family. But life went on. As I grew older, I grew to love my average life. My parents paid a little more attention to me with Jenny gone. I went to a state university for journalism, where I met my husband, Alan. We got married right out of college. I worked for the local paper, and he had an office job at a company just a few blocks down the road. Our life was blissful, beautiful, and unremarkable. Until, that is, I became pregnant. It started when I was about 2 weeks late. I've always been as regular as a clock, but this time, work was pretty hectic, and I wasn't really paying attention. Then, one night, I had a terribly real, terribly strange dream. In the dream, I was in my old childhood room, sitting on the flower-patterned comforter on my twin-sized bed, playing with a pacifier for God knows what reason. In walked Jenny. She came in and climbed on the bed. She was toying with an empty pill bottle. She looked into my eyes. I don't know why, but I woke up screaming. To be honest, I hadn't paid much thought to Jenny in years, and I'd never had a dream like that. My husband woke up to comfort me, but I was already on my way to the bathroom. I vomited into the toilet for about 20 minutes, thinking of missed periods, pill bottles, and Jenny. I took a pregnancy test that day. It came out positive. My husband and I were overjoyed. We celebrated with a nice dinner. We called our parents, who were both incredibly excited. We talked about baby names, nursery, and all the things you associate with babies. We got to bed late, exhausted but happy, cuddling together like newlyweds, dreaming of the little one dancing in our arms. I woke up to see my sister standing next to the bed. If the night before had been frightening, you can imagine how this felt. Here she was, Jenny. The real, not-so-alive Jenny. She stared down at me. I reached out. I almost felt as though I could touch her. But she turned and walked out of the room. From that day on, Jenny was always there. She was standing next to the bed when I woke up in the morning. She followed me to work. She watched as I picked out baby clothes, occasionally fingering one or two items that she particularly liked. She was always there. Sure, I thought about telling my husband, but what would I say? That his average wife was about to disturb his average life with her newfound ability to see the dead? Unlikely. Rather, I considered it a strange and extraordinary experience in my otherwise unremarkable life. Besides, I enjoyed it, in a way. Here was my long-lost sister, my ages ago best friend, the one person who I looked up to, the person I wanted to be when I grew up. She was back again. It was comforting to have her there as my stomach grew fat and round, and I began to waddle back and forth, trying to control my deranged hormones. Sometimes, she would put her hand on my stomach to feel the baby. When she did, the baby would start to kick. How comforting to know that my baby would share a special connection with Jenny. Jenny was there when my husband drove me to the hospital, crying in the back through the pain of my contractions. She followed us to the maternity ward and stood calmly next to me as I pushed, and pushed. She kept her hand placed on my stomach, and it was a comfort. Then it was over. They placed the baby into my arms. A girl, a wonderful, plump, little baby girl, whose cries were the most beautiful thing in the world. Alan and I played with her tiny, curling fingers, but when I looked to my bedside, Jenny was gone. Now, don't misunderstand. I have always missed my sister. She was very important to me, and I miss her still, but I was somewhat relieved to see her gone. I missed her, but she could never be a part of my life again. Now I could return to my happy, typical life. My happy life with my happy baby and happy husband. I was happy for a few weeks before I noticed it. I was playing with little baby Ellen when she looked up at me, and I noticed them. her startling blue eyes, the eyes that neither her father nor I possessed. She looked at me with an eerie calmness. When I looked into her eyes, I saw Jenny. And so, tomorrow morning, I will fall to the floor in an outburst of tears and screams. Alan will frantically dial emergency services as I will clutch the body of my child. When the EMTs arrive, they will pry the cold, lifeless body from my embrace, and I will collapse into Alan's arms. I will be sad. I will miss her, just as I miss Jenny. But Jenny can never be a part of my life again, no matter how much she wants to be. After all, it took me years to be rid of her the first time. I cannot describe to you how I feel right now. What I'm experiencing is so detached from the normal, I'm almost convinced I've finally gone insane. Almost. My wife, B, died during childbirth. She was gorgeous, funny, intelligent, stubborn. A woman whose laugh was so loud, eating in restaurants was a challenge. A woman whose stare was so intense, it made my hands shake. I lost her as she gave birth to our daughter, Sam. Of course, I could have resented Sam for taking away what was once mine in a way nothing else can be, for taking away what was so truly and utterly pure. But I didn't. I knew B wouldn't have wanted any resentment. She wouldn't have wanted our only child to have a life ruined by hate. But this isn't about grief. This isn't about the physical sucker punch of losing forever something you loved. This is about something far more sinister. My daughter was lively, always running and screaming, leaping up and down the climbing frame, causing havoc in her classes. So, for her 6th birthday, a trip with friends to the movies had left her so pent up with energy, I could barely keep up with her as she dipped and dodged between people on the pavement. She'd occasionally turn back through the sea of people and shout, "Daddy, come on!" in a tone that was almost petulant. I couldn't help but love her. I tried to chase her. I really did. She was too busy looking at me when she dashed out onto the road, and the bus didn't have time to stop. A sickening crunch, and the world fell silent. I cradled her broken form in my arms, too numb to weep, too hurt to move. All I could feel was the warm, crimson liquid gently seep into my clothes. In the state of shock I was in, I could just think about how I was going to wash my jeans. It sounds horrid, I know, but a loss like that tears everything away from you and leaves you with only the bare thought processes that make us human. The next week was a blur. I cannot place a single memory to a time, in between friends and family extending their condolences, and the howling sobs of mine that would break out at any moment. I attended her funeral dressed in all black. By dressed, I don't mean merely clothes. My very essence was dark. I couldn't feel or think, and the day continued as I went through the motions, like a dying man treading water. Everyone wanted to tell me about Sam, how perfect she was, what an angel she was, as if I didn't know, as if I didn't realize what a gift my own daughter was. The man stood out from the rest. As he walked up to me and handed me this large leather book, I assumed at the time he was a parent of one of Sam's friends, handing me a collection of their photos together. Or maybe I was too numb to even process his cold hands, and how he never mentioned my daughter once. For a month, I was lost. I drank and stayed in our now empty apartment alone, watching old box sets, too numb to now even cry. It was only when my sister arrived, when she held my hand and talked to me, that I began to come out of my shell. She'd sit and listen to the most inane things I said and gently coaxed me out of my depression. Not completely, but enough for me to begin to live what was almost a real life again. That was when I opened the book. I decided to remember Sam for all the joy she gave, and I was prepared to reflect on her life without feeling miserable. I opened the first page. It was essentially a binder, full of Polaroid photos of my daughter growing up. I furrowed my brow. They were taken from a distance, blurred slightly, and I was in a few of them. I began to feel sick, but hoped that the following photos would provide some explanation. I came up with every excuse of how the man obtained these photos, desperate to view these moments of my daughter's life without a sense of trepidation. The photos grew closer and closer to my daughter's birthday. I could see the day I gave her a tiny bike after she turned 5, and the skinned knees that ensued. The book had so many more pages that I assumed the rest were empty. But there was a photo of her just before the movies on her 6th birthday. I could recognize the pink raincoat she insisted on wearing, and my hands on her shoulders. There was no photo of the crash. Instead, her life continued inside this book. Her 7th birthday had a photo of me and her in the garden, covered in paint, with a huge canvas on the floor and an extremely messy painting. Her 7th birthday. Her 7th birthday. The reality of what I was seeing hit me, and then I slammed the book shut. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the leather. This must be some sadistic Photoshop, I hoped. Someone had taken the time to pull a horrid prank on me. I say I hoped, because essentially, I couldn't believe any other explanation, if there even was one. Gritting my teeth, I decided I had nothing to lose and kept reading. I can't explain the emotions I felt whilst I read, listening to the sound of the page turning. I can try, but nothing could prepare you for something like this. Her life continued, showing her losing her baby teeth, her first day of senior school. My turning the pages became more frenzied, and I began to notice something. The photographer was getting closer to her. As he grew older, not in every photo, but a general trend, the photographer was getting closer and closer. More daring, perhaps. She was beautiful, stunning. As a teenager, she looked just like her mother, all curls and smiles. I grew older too, but the photos began to include me less and less. Her 16th birthday was strange. A group of her friends sitting outside, drinking from little plastic cups at a picnic. But there was someone in the background. Near the bushes of the park where this was taken, a dark figure stood. You wouldn't have noticed him, if not for the small shadow he cast on the grass. I leaned back for a moment and exhaled. This was too weird. I'd been so caught up in watching my little girl grow up, I hadn't thought about how this would end. Moments like this are so utterly surreal that sometimes you remove yourself from them. I almost felt like I was watching myself read these, like this was a dream or a program on the television. I continued. The dark figure became more and more present in each photograph. I could almost make out features. His presence was towering. And as I turned the page, I expected to see him disappear. But instead, as the photographs grew closer to her 18th birthday, she was no longer somewhere that I recognized. Instead, the photos were of her in a dimly lit house, her face contorted by fear, striking all sorts of weird poses. Sometimes she would be dressed like an ancient queen, or she would be dressed like a maid scrubbing the floors. The figure was even closer now, his legs, or his arm would appear in each and every one. No matter how she was dressed, in every photo her face had this desperately pained expression. It killed me. There were bruises on her face. She looked thin, ill even. I couldn't do it. This was sick. Properly sick. My girl. I soldiered on. The last photo I looked at, before I slammed the book shut and swore to never, ever look at it again, was of her 18th. The caption underneath read, "At last," in sloppy writing. She was looking straight at the camera, crying. She was on her knees, dressed in a black evening dress, with an apple in her mouth and her hands bound behind her back. Her makeup was ruined by her tears. It was as if she was pleading me, begging me to help. But I couldn't. I closed the book and left the room, my whole body convulsing with sobs. I couldn't call the police, of course. She was dead. The thing that keeps me up at night, though, isn't the content of what I saw. It's that there were so many pages left.